the future of tall buildings in Australia. So, in pondering this, I thought I'd go back to the start of things, which I've never really done before in any significant way, and I found a really, really interesting fact. And that fact is that, believe it or not, Australia, at one moment in time, had the tallest building in the world. So I read in some of the history books. Yes, 1889. 53 metres tall, but it had a steel frame, masonry cladding and a hydraulic lift. It had the ingredients for building tall. Of course, these days we can build like this in timber, very sustainable, but we were on our way. We came between Chicago and New York for 1 year. I thought that was rather great. But it's interesting to look at what's happened to tall buildings around the year. And if you look at this little CTBUH graph, you'll see that 290 tall buildings were finished last year, over 150 metres tall, 9 of which were in Australia. So we're part of the tall building journey, we can't deny it. And also, yeah, you can see that Australia, 9 buildings, so we're really part of it. I also thought I'd just show a snapshot of the evolution of tall buildings. And you'll see in Melbourne, it was 70 years before since the APA building, that we had our first curtain wall. And today, Eureka still stands as the tallest floor plate in Australia and certainly the tallest building in Melbourne. And in Sydney, the building that Elizabeth mentioned, which in 1912 was 50 metres tall, and today I think that the Crown Hotel at Barangaroo it is going to be, well, in a couple of years, 271 metres tall. So tall buildings are something we have to deal with. They are coming, they are here, they need to be thought about, and so pieces of work like the Central Sydney planning strategy are very, very important. Pathways for inserting buildings into our built fabric and regarding shadow planes and respect for where they're being put are very, very critical. Globally, the last 10 years has been really interesting, and Bosco Verticale, a fantastic building in Milano, which I saw a year or so ago, and which won CTBUH Best Building a couple of years ago. The idea of greening the building, but it's not just planting, it's trees. So this humid microclimate has really enabled the building to be shaded, to create oxygen, and take the park, which is at the front of the building, up the building and make an incredible green sculptural statement in Milano. Very unusual and quite wonderful. And in a different way, the Shanghai Tower, which won last year's CTBUH award, has a double skin. It's LEED Platinum, double skin, and that creates breakout spaces for the building. So it protects the building thermally, but provides the occupants of the building with wonderful atria and gardens for use. And parametrics these days, we can now, it simplifies the whole potential for creating the shapes of nature and sculptural buildings. So there's a lot at our hands in making buildings interesting, and certainly the crafting of the inside of the buildings with agile workplace and new ways of working. The idea that carving out the inside so that a community of workers, co-workers, can see each other, be part of a sculptural interior, meet and greet on the stairways that become the sort of linkage pathways, the social connectors in the building, is very interesting. And so in Australia, I mean, we're following the same trajectory. Central Park by Jean Nouvel, which Elizabeth mentioned, what an incredible improvement to that area this building's made, and the idea of the heliostats harvesting sunlight and putting that sunlight into the public spaces is quite remarkable. In Melbourne, we're working with our great colleagues at Cox Architecture on a couple of towers which are about to start being built. Sure, the towers have got a kind of urban responsibility to be sculptural, interesting, seen from a distance, help make the character of the city, but it's how they reach the ground. This is in the precinct of the Victoria Market, which is very vibrant, people-oriented, And so the podium has been crafted into laneways, places to meet and greet, opportunities for socialising, and laneways cut through, because of course, for those of you who haven't been to Melbourne, Melbourne is really based on a laneway culture, and it's a very wonderful, vibrant, kind of private, interesting network through the streets of the city, and this builds on that idea. Melbourne Quarter, another project we're doing at the moment with Lend-Lease, part of a 5-tower complex on a pretty tough, what was a pretty tough part of the city, the western corner. It's actually where the city started, but 3 of the towers are residential, and a few hundred apartments, a few hundred dwellings, and again the ground plane on top of the car park has been transformed, will be transformed into quite a beautiful garden. And this is quite interesting because there's a kind of connection between the facilities for the residents in that rectangle that you can see, which are the pools, the gyms, the socialising areas, and the park, which has brought a soft place into what was a hard place in the city. And Melbourne is based on the love of parks and gardens. And in fact, if the facilities in the tower could be utilised for the public as well, you're blending, you're not siloing public and private interaction. Another project which deals with the urban realm or the ground plane realm is called Yarra One, not in the city, but in a suburb just near the city. And what this does, it's located on the centre of a walkway, a pedestrian pathway that the local council had made, but it wasn't very good. It connected the vibrant and the retail pageantry of Chapel Street to Yarra Street, which is on the railway. So it's a great desire line from retail to railway station, but it wasn't really working, it was colourless. And so the opportunity of putting a building here presented the opportunity of creating a destination and a place that would enrich what is otherwise a fairly moribund pathway. So the idea of placing a veranda, a huge kind of timber veranda planted, which had stages, seating, performance, and will have retail, restaurants and cafes, is a way of energising a pathway and hopefully energising that part of the city. But that, of course, comes at a cost, and so how was that achieved? It was achieved through the conversation with council, and this is how we're going to get great urban outcomes, through collaboration and sharing of visions. And so this building, which provided a softening to the street that was in, was paid for to the developer by additional height to the building at no real detriment to anybody. And the idea that towers can be more than just extruded forms, and that towers can contribute to the personality and the character of a city and become part of the sculpture of a city. So in Australia 108, the expressing of the facilities inside the building, and also swimming pools, gyms, all of those sort of things, and also providing equal opportunity for the people that live in the lower reaches of the building and maybe in smaller apartments to come up, enjoy the view, but also use kitchen, dining facilities if they wanted to entertain. So a bit of democracy within the building. So sustainable futures, so very important. We all know this, it's stating the obvious, but I just hark back to this incredible exhibition that John Gollings and Ivan Ridjevic put together for the Venice Architectural Biennale in 2010, Now and When. And this harvested the ideas of architects around Australia, their ideas about future high density or higher density living, the future of high rise. And it showed really a huge concern and an interest in what the high rise of the future will be. Sustainability. Again, I go to Australia 108. This tower, it's 300 metres tall, 318 metres tall. It houses 1,100 dwellings. Now, it sits on 3/4 of an acre, and in suburbia, 3/4 of an acre is about 4 homes. This is 1,100 homes. So the idea of constraining the suburban sprawl and using land more efficiently is quite interesting. 1,100 homes means, in a suburban context, 220 acres, and possibly a couple of thousand cars driving for an hour or two every day to workplace or shopping or wherever. So I really believe in vertical living. I do it myself. I love it. A lot of us all do that, and it definitely has a place in our future. Ross Harding, he's a principal of Finding Infinity. It's a very nice little statement. Cities need to transform from consumers to producers, and tall buildings can be a part of this. And why? Because they have the scale and the economics that can allow that to happen. So he does a little case study. His work, he took Eureka Tower, which is about 675,000 cubic metres, and said, and calculated that, for instance, in Sydney, we currently consume enough energy to utilise 4 Eureka Towers full of coal every year. And we create enough waste to fill 18 Eureka Towers every year. And we consume enough water to fill 180 Eureka Towers every year. So this is where towers, buildings, can actually help neutralise all of this. For instance, with water, producing the treated water in the building. And by the way, this is in an ideal world. Obviously, we can't build a city full of buildings that do this, but it kind of demonstrates, when you see what a building can do, how collectively they can make a difference. 95% of the water that we drink is not used for potable purposes. And so by just increasing the efficiency of water use, we can limit water wastage. Waste, transforming waste into a city resource, we can actually eliminate, in his view, we can eliminate waste by reuse. And with energy, the buildings can give power back to the city. In fact, we now have glazing that actually from light can produce power. That's not sunlight, that's just light, street light, for instance. So the way forward with tall buildings is obviously to be able to deal with that, but that requires investment from the developers. And how do you do that? Well, you know, the plant and equipment or whatever is required to make buildings a neutral with respect to sustainability is to give them a little bit more area. And if there's no great loss, then allow more height to get more return to be able to pay for a sustainable future. And the naysayers. I don't mind criticism. I love criticism, but the criticism has to be intelligent. And I think that saying things like high-rise living has a number of drawbacks, including social isolation and diminished public realm amenity, I think these are overreactions. I think that we need to concentrate on criticism of design, not criticism of the typology. I think that we need high-rise and high density. It's not the only way to create high density, but high-rise is definitely a part of it. So I think let's concentrate on, as Elizabeth said, great design outcomes. Let's not just condemn the typology. And to what extent that those sort of articles influence planning policy, I'm not sure. That's another discussion. But planning law is so important. So I thought I'd just go through some small case studies. Phoenix is a little building that we did just on one of the entries to the city. It has a slenderness ratio of 15:1. It was jump formed, pretty interesting little building, and it marked an entry into the city. It was completed in 2015, but earlier this year we had planning law changes. They came in overnight, plot ratios. I don't mind plot ratios either, but let's sort of legislate for outcomes rather than just cutting out possibilities. If this had a plot ratio of 18:1, the building would have been cut down and just become part of the wall of the building next door, and a way of marking one of the entries to the city would have been lost. Australia 108, I'll go back to Australia 108. The permit was issued in 2013, 100 stories, 1,100 apartments, and today if we were conforming to plot ratios, it would be 30 stories, a quarter of the number of apartments. And as you can see from the construction photo, the building in the lower left corner is about the height of 30 stories, just adds to the wall of the buildings in City Road, which has been very, very much criticised. At least now it's going to work as a marker with Eureka Tower to a whole precinct of the city. Setbacks, they came in with the plot ratios. A couple of buildings that we did, a pairing, a bit inspired by Pomodoro and his taut skins and interesting interiors, but the two towers allowed light to go down through an oculus in the podium and create a rather remarkable public space. But overnight, and it was overnight, we read about it in the papers, we had new setback rules which meant our two towers, which were quite admired by the authorities, we would have had about 2 metres of floor space around each of the cores, which wasn't going to work. So obviously it became one core, one building. Yes, you can do a very nice building, but the opportunity for a pairing of towers, a sculptural kind of interesting inclusion in the city was lost, and the idea of getting light down through the podium was also lost. Structure going forward becomes increasingly important. How do we reduce structure? And if anyone saw one of the workshops, the work of James Murray Parkes, his statement, more maths, less mass, is quite compelling. He has this elliptical energy pathway theorem, the pathways that the forces of nature work, and he looks at grass, trees, and the way they work with the wind, don't fight the wind. And so the next diagrams show the inverted pendulum of most buildings, which are quite stiff and need dampeners to stop the sway and need a bit of structure as well. And so his view that if you can make the buildings more flexible so they kind of work with nature, you'll see that the deflection at the top is not nearly as much, and in his laboratory model testing to see what the joints, the impact of these sort of things on the joints, but all leading to less materiality. Nonda Katsalidis and systems. I quote Nonda because he's been working for 10 years on systems building, and I think that this is definitely the future of tall buildings, to less activity on the site, more activity off-site, accurate, safe, and much more sustainable. And by way of example, these red walls are actually shear walls, which are normally formed on site. These are shear walls that are reinforced, made in a factory out of steel, lifted into place, and concrete poured. No removal of formwork, but a very simple, elegant procedure. And his idea of a steel box frame on-site assembly, where the frames are made, they can be lifted into place using gantries and incorporating the glass walls. Faster, more accurate, incredible gantry systems that can be computerized and work like 3D printers so that these things just stack, and again to reduce site activity and gain accuracy, far more quick and far more sustainable. Vertical transportation, incredibly important in high-rise, as we all know, and the idea of magnetic levitation and multiple carriages in one shaft means that all sorts of building forms can be created. Buildings can be linked so that the idea of vertical communities can be extended, and of course the shafts, there's less requirement for concrete and less requirement for shafts. So yes, we have the technology to build tall, and Mr. Les Robertson sitting here, the renowned engineer from New York, would say that you can build almost to infinity if you build on the equator, and where there's no lateral gravitational forces, and no doubt Les could do that. But I don't think that that's the future of high-rise in Australia. I don't think there's any need to be pursuing the heights that we see in other parts of the world. And I think that this statement by Robert Bird, who's a very good friend and a very enlightened engineer, tall buildings are fundamental enablers. And I think that's what the future of high-rise in Australia is. And if I could just leave you with the thought that these powerhouses, they can help with sustainability, they can look after themselves, they can look after the city, but really they need to exist and to enrich the social and cultural opportunities of our city. And I think that's the most critical thing about high-rise going forward. Thank you.